The story of the sari is not really the story of fashion. It's a story of a civilization figuring out how to drape cloth around the human body. And over thousands of years, that simple act absorbed almost everything that shaped Indian society: climate, caste, religion, colonialism, trade, cinema, modernity. Which is why the sari is so difficult to define. It has never been just clothing. At different moments in history, it has functioned as workwear, ritual wear, political symbolism, caste marker, national identity, and even cinematic fantasy. The sari has survived as a garment over centuries because it kept changing with India itself. There are over 180 documented ways to wear a sari, and that's not just a fun cultural fact. Each drape represents a region, a community, a memory, a way of saying, I come from here. The way a woman wears a sari could reveal her region, her caste, her marital status, whether she was widowed, whether she belonged to a laboring community or an elite household. A white sari meant something different in Bengal than elsewhere. Gold borders could signal status. Certain fabrics were reserved for upper castes. The sari operated almost like a social language stitched into fabric. And most modern assumptions about the sari are surprisingly recent. Today, when people picture a traditional sari, they usually imagine a neatly pleated drape, a fitted blouse, and a petticoat underneath. We believe that this ensemble was always how the sari was. But actually, the truth is quite different. For most of Indian history, women wore draped garments without fitted undergarments, which means often there was no blouse, sometimes no petticoat. The modern blouse and petticoat sari system only became normalized much later, which means what many Indians today think of as timeless tradition is actually a heavily hybridized colonial era garment. And that's what makes the sari fascinating. Its history is not linear, it evolves through negotiation. We see this negotiation happen between heat and fabric, between ritual and practicality, between caste and dignity, between colonialism and resistance, between regional identity and national identity. One of the biggest turning points came with British colonial rule. The British arrived in a subcontinent where women wore draped garments without fitted undergarments. By Victorian standards, this was scandalous. Missionaries and colonial officials increasingly described Indian dress as indecent and improper. We know that the colonial project wasn't just economic, it also wanted to morally improve India according to Victorian sensibilities, which meant reshaping Indian bodies into something that looked respectable to the colonial gaze. For most of its history, the sari was simply an unstitched drape. That flexibility is exactly what made it work so well in the Indian subcontinent. India's climate is tropical, humid, and monsoon heavy. An unstitched garment could loosen in extreme heat, it could tighten during physical labor, you could cover your head from harsh sunlight, it could be used to carry objects, and it even functioned as infant support. It was breathable, washable, adaptable. If you look carefully at Indian temple sculptures, you begin to realize how different pre modern ideas of the body actually were. You can look at Khajuraho, Ajanta, Konark, Chola bronzes. Across these traditions, women are shown in semi transparent drapes, low waisted garments, exposed midriffs, sometimes bare breasted forms. And these figures were not portrayed as shameful. They were divine, they were sacred and powerful. The relationship between clothing and morality in pre modern India was very different from Victorian Europe. That doesn't mean pre modern India was perfectly progressive, but modesty norms were organized differently. The exposed midriff was not automatically sexualized. Exposed skin was not immediately treated as indecency. That stigma intensified later under colonial morality, and this is important because modern people often project current standards backward into history. But the idea of modesty changes with power, with religion, with empire, with who gets to define what respectability is. Under colonialism, Indian clothing slowly began changing, especially among urban elites. Women entering colonial institutions, schools, clubs, and public life increasingly faced pressure to appear respectable according to British standards. This is where the sari begins transforming into its modern form. And this was not because Indian women abandoned tradition, but because colonized societies often adapt themselves to survive inside systems of imperial power. The blouse and petticoat became increasingly normalized in the 19th century. And this is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The traditional Indian sari blouse is heavily shaped by Victorian fashion. The petticoat underneath is also Victorian. Even the words blouse and petticoat are actually English words imported directly into Indian vocabulary. So, the modern sari most people recognize today is not ancient continuity, it's a hybrid. It is India draping traditions fused with colonial ideas of propriety. Blouses were not just practical garments, they became signals. You could say they became markers of the educated, refined, urban, modern. The colonial elite increasingly associated stitched upper garments with civility itself, and over time these standards spread through urban society. What counted as proper Indian womanhood shifted under colonial influence. Before standardization, sari draping across India was astonishingly diverse. There wasn't one national style, there were hundreds, each shaped by geography, labor, and local tradition. Even today, traces survive. We see Gujarati Sidha Pallu, Maharashtrian Nawari, Bengali drapes, Kodagu styles, Madisar traditions. Every drape carries historical memory inside it. The climate of a region has gone a long way in shaping the sari. In humid Bengal, lighter cotton heavy drapes made sense. In tropical heat, breathable fabric mattered. An unstitched garment allowed movement, ventilation, flexibility. Once you stop viewing the sari as traditional costume and start viewing it as climate adaptation, the entire garment suddenly makes sense. In Gujarat's dry western regions, the Sidha Pallu drape evolved for practical reasons. The pallu comes from the back to the front, over the shoulder, creating a secure wrap which is resistant to dusty, high velocity desert winds. It worked well during rural labor. It protected the body from harsh environmental conditions. On the Konkan coast, fisherwomen traditionally wore shorter Nawari drapes suited for humid, watery conditions. The style allowed movement through shallow water and physical labor without dragging heavy, wet fabric around. And this is something people often forget. For most women historically, the sari was not ceremonial wear, it was daily work wear. The garment evolved around labor as much as beauty. And that adaptability is probably why the sari survived for so long. It could become ritual clothing, court clothing, agricultural workwear, urban fashion, political symbolism, or modern corporate attire. Few garments evolved this successfully across thousands of years. The sari survived because it was never rigid. It kept mutating with society. But the sari also carried hierarchy inside it. Clothing in India often communicated caste and social rank. Upper caste had access to certain fabrics and ornamentation. Lower caste was sometimes restricted from gold borders, certain textiles, and even upper garments. Widows in many communities wore plain white saris stripped of ornamentation. Fabric itself became a form of social control. And in some regions, clothing restrictions became deeply violent. Lower caste women were historically forbidden from covering their breasts, not because of modesty, but because caste hierarchy demanded visible humiliation. The body itself became a marker of social rank. This is the darker side of clothing history. Fashion can become power enforced directly onto the body. In Travancore, lower caste women who attempted to cover themselves could face financial punishment through the infamous breast covering tax known as Mulakaram. The system made dignity economically punitive. The message was clear. Certain people were not allowed the same bodily respectability as elites. And this is why the history of the sari cannot be separated from caste. The right to dress with dignity was itself historically unequal. Eventually, resistance emerged. The Channar Revolt in Kerala became a prolonged struggle over whether lower caste Nadar women had the right to cover their bodies, and the backlash was fierce. Violence erupted repeatedly. Rights were briefly granted and then withdrawn. Upper caste resistance intensified. Even when reforms finally arrived in 1859, they were still discriminatory. Nadar women could cover themselves, but not in ways that resembled upper caste women. That's how tightly clothing and social hierarchy were linked. The modern navy drape, the version most people instantly recognize today, emerged in the mid 1800s as a hybrid. This has pleats at the navel, pallu over the shoulder, blouse and petticoat underneath. It balanced multiple pressures at once: Indian identity, colonial respectability, and modern mobility. What looks timeless today was actually engineered during colonial modernity. One of the most important figures in this transformation was Jnanadanandini Devi Tagore, sister-in-law of Rabindranath Tagore. During a visit to Bombay, she was denied entry into an English club because her traditional attire was considered inappropriate by colonial standards. Instead of accepting exclusion, she began studying how Parsi and Gujarati women had adapted their clothing. She combined those influences with English tailoring and helped popularize a new sari style: high necked blouses, long sleeves, structured tailoring inspired directly by Victorian chemises. That hybrid style later spread widely through elite Bengali society. And then something remarkable happened. This hybrid colonial era sari gradually became treated as authentic Indian tradition. Raja Ravi Verma's paintings helped mass popularize the look. Magazine culture spread it further among urban elites. And eventually, this Andhra, Bengali, Parsi, Victorian fusion became the default image of the Indian sari both nationally and globally, which means the modern sari carries layers of history inside it. We see Persian motifs in Banarasi silk, Roman trade in muslin, Chinese influence in weaving, European tailoring in blouses, regional Indian drapes underneath it all. The sari is not culturally pure, it is centuries of exchange from global influences woven together. And maybe that's the most fascinating thing about the sari. It never stopped evolving. Temple cultures shaped Kanjivarams, Paitanis, and Garhwals. Persian motifs entered Banarasi brocades through silk weavers who migrated from Gujarat. Patola silks from Gujarat became sacred ritual objects in parts of Indonesia. Bollywood transformed the sari again by creating female archetypes, like the suffering mother in white cotton sari, the intellectual woman in handloom, the romantic heroine in airy chiffon saris, and the hyper glamorous icon in sequins. So the next time you look at the traditional attire, any traditional attire hanging in your closet, ask yourself this question: what hidden histories and struggles and adaptations does this come from?